Losses are increasing while the ability to advance is decreasing. Russian troops are advancing slowly, and fewer people are willing to go to the front, even despite the payments. How could this affect peace negotiations? And what strategy is the Kremlin already using to keep the war going? Let's break it down. Officially, Russia last reported its total losses in September 2022. The Ministry of Defense of the aggressor country reported 6,000 dead. Even then, everyone understood perfectly well that this number was greatly understated. There was a lot of criticism. Some relatives of the dead and missing even tried to protest, recorded video appeals, and held solo pickets. It all ended with the Kremlin banning any talk about losses altogether. Since the beginning of this year, the number of Russian servicemen killed or missing in Ukraine has increased significantly. This was reported by the Financial Times, citing intelligence data from several countries at once. At the same time, the advances made by Russian troops are minimal. Essentially, the Russian army is losing its ability to conduct high-intensity operations.
Putin's bet was that constant pressure along a wide front would eventually cause the Ukrainian side to collapse. But the way Russian forces are operating simply won't allow for any operationally significant breakthroughs. Instead of large-scale mechanized assaults, Russian units are increasingly using infantry groups, light motor vehicles, and infiltration tactics. Essentially, they're trading previous equipment losses for much higher losses in personnel. Michael Kofman, senior fellow at the International Analytical Center, in a column for the Financial Times.
According to Ukrainian intelligence estimates, the Russian army is suffering its greatest losses on the front lines, between 30 and 35,000 killed and severely wounded every month. If the situation doesn't change, by summer, the aggressor country could lose another 100 to 120,000 frontline soldiers, and replacing them quickly will be extremely difficult. As Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy told journalists at a meeting, this puts the Kremlin in a tough position, and one possible solution could be a large-scale mobilization.
They won't be able to make up for this deficit easily, especially considering, among other things, the shortage of money. This means they'll have to make tough decisions. What kind of decisions? Mobilization. Then it's an irreversible process. If Putin announces a large-scale mobilization, we understand what kind of impact that will have on their society and on him personally. I don't believe he would stop the war anytime soon in that case. Volodymyr Zelenskyy, president of Ukraine, in an interview with the media.
During the full-scale war, Russia has lost thousands of elite servicemen. According to the BBC, this includes special forces from the main intelligence directorate, airborne troops, special operations forces, pilots, and Marines. These units were the core of the army. Years and millions of dollars were spent on their training. Now, Putin doesn't have those options, and all he can do is stall for time. Well-known columnist Mark Champion writes in a Bloomberg column that the Russian Federation has long since turned peace negotiations into a weapon. And if the White House truly wants to reach a peace agreement, it must increase pressure on the Kremlin and stop taking steps that give Moscow any advantages or encourage the continuation of the war against Ukraine.
During the Biden administration, the most effective tool Vladimir Putin had to sustain the invasion of Ukraine turned out to be his warnings about nuclear escalation. This tactic prompted Kyiv's allies to gradually supply it with weapons, fearing they might provoke a nuclear war. That threat has lost its power due to overuse, but in the Trump era, the Kremlin has acquired an even more powerful weapon, the peace process. Mark Champion, political columnist, in a column for Bloomberg.
In addition, the Kremlin is actively conducting a so-called cognitive warfare campaign. Russian troops are simulating an offensive in the border areas in northern Ukraine, trying to convince the West that the front is collapsing. Russian propaganda describes local border skirmishes as the beginning of a new major offensive. For example, on February 8th, the Russian Ministry of Defense claimed to have allegedly captured the village of Sidorovka near the border in the Sumy region. At the same time, the so-called Z military bloggers immediately began saying that this was part of creating a buffer zone. However, as analysts from the Institute for the Study of War note, there is no confirmation or visual evidence of control over the settlement. Putin's goal here is obvious: to strengthen the narrative of the Russian Federation's inevitable victory and force Ukraine and the West to make concessions.
At the end of December 2025, the Kremlin launched a cognitive warfare campaign using cross-border attacks in the north of the Sumy region and the Kharkiv regions in an attempt to exert informational influence and affect the ongoing negotiations to end the war. The Institute for the Study of War has found no evidence that Russian forces have achieved any significant success in reaching operationally meaningful objectives, or any signs that Russia is preparing for a major offensive against Ukraine from the north. From the report of the Institute for the Study of War.
Russia is very eager to use peace negotiations with Ukraine as a tool to restore relations with the United States. This is stated in a report by Estonia's Foreign Intelligence Service. According to the agency's assessment, Moscow, and I quote, is playing games at the negotiating table while its strategic goal remains unchanged: to seize and destroy Ukraine. At the same time, the Kremlin has instructed state agencies to demonstrate openness to cooperation with Washington in every possible way, aiming to restore direct air travel and visa opportunities for the business elite. In addition, lifting sanctions is critically important for the Russian dictator since the aggressor country's economy is falling apart at the seams.
Moscow has no intention of ending the war until its goals are achieved or until conditions become favorable for doing so. For Russia, any potential settlement must harm the interests of Ukraine and the countries supporting it. Russia constantly tries to use peace negotiations as a tool for manipulation, once again exploiting the West's goodwill to justify new and even greater demands. Despite this illusory thaw, Russia's goals remain unchanged. It seeks to sideline the United States and NATO and to reshape Europe's security architecture according to Moscow's vision. From the report of Estonia's Foreign Intelligence.
By the way, many people in Washington understand this perfectly well. For example, one of the White House chief's advisors, retired General Bruce Carlson, advocates for increasing pressure on the Kremlin and emphasizes that Donald Trump is already implementing this strategy. Already, the situation is developing unfavorably for Russia. The U.S. is depriving Moscow of both key partners and access to resources. The goal is to leave Putin no room to maneuver and to make him think about the consequences of prolonging the war.
In any campaign, you don't just strike command centers, you cut off supply lines and logistics. Putting pressure on Russia's puppets does exactly that. Venezuela, Iran, and the Shadow Fleet are key arteries fueling Russia's war against Ukraine. Additionally, by pressuring Europe to increase NATO spending and to give up Russian oil and gas, we are directly changing the decision-making process in Moscow. Bruce Carlson, retired Air Force general, in an interview with Fox News.
Well, as losses mount on the front lines, the Kremlin is betting on dragging things out and pretending to be ready for compromise. That means Moscow will continue to ramp up pressure through information operations and diplomatic maneuvers. And as before, the outcome of peace talks largely depends on whether the West maintains its firmness and unity in response to this tactic.